Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to 2025's first installment of the Dialogues on Divinity. My name is Caleb Parker. I am a member of the community at The Crossing, which organizes this series. It is an ecumenical formation year here at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Our members give a year to spiritual formation, to prayer and discernment, to biblical and theological study, to community life, and to service and mission. Like everything we do with the community at The Crossing, we are 100% donor supported. So we want to express our gratitude to you for supporting this event. And if in the course of the afternoon you are inspired to make an additional gift, we would be very grateful if you did so. There is a QR code in your pamphlets which you can scan to get to an online giving portal. There's also a basket on the table at the front of the choir where we can accept cash and check. Now, you also received a piece of paper as you came in on which you are free to write any questions you might have for the panelists. In the course of the event, they will be collected, curated, and some of them will be posed in order to open up the dialogue. And now to introduce our esteemed guest, please welcome 11th Dean of the Cathedral, the Reverend Dr. Patrick Malloy.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here. Dr. Levine was here last year, and she and I had a conversation like this. And one member of the gathering told me, who's a very wise woman, told me it was the finest thing of its sort she'd ever experienced in all of her many, many years of going to such things. And I think that is because of the quality, first of all, of Dr. Levine's scholarship and her mind, but also just because she is really funny. And Dr. Levine is such a wonderful person to talk to, because talking to Dr. Levine makes things that could become very bookish and dry very much alive and warm and personal. So we are delighted, and we are also especially delighted for those of you who are here who would not normally be here to spend this time with Dr. Levine. And I suspect that many of you here today are Jewish, and I know that these are very difficult days for people in the Jewish community. And I want to assure you that those of us here at the Cathedral are deeply mindful of your struggles, and especially deeply mindful of the rise in anti-Semitism in our culture these days. So thank you for being here, and thank you for trusting us when I suspect so many people who call themselves Christians are not particularly kind to you. So thank you for being here. Before we get on with our conversation, I was going to introduce Dr. Levine, but that's kind of silly. You know, I mean, everyone knows who Dr. Levine is, and that's why you're here. But we are delighted that you're here, delighted. And Dr. Levine, as I said, is just a wonderful conversation partner. But who I would like to introduce you to is Dr. Aaron Hollander, who comes to us from the Graymore Ecumenical Institute, I think is what you call it. And Dr. Hollander is going to say a word to us before Dr. Levine and I begin our conversation.
Thanks so much. Hello, good to see you. I didn't see you beforehand. Thank you so much. Just indulge me for one moment to add my words of welcome to Dean Malloy's and the communities. It's so good to see Dr. Levine again. It's good to see all of you here. I'm Aaron Hollander, director of the Graymore Institute, which is co-sponsoring this wonderful series of dialogues, not only today's, but throughout the spring. We are a Franciscan ministry for interchurch and interreligious peace building. And this is what these conversations are all about, not only to take the opportunity for education and learning to uproot misunderstandings, but also to sustain and grow relationships. And it's so wonderful to see you here now for the second year in a row, and it's a sign that this is working, that our relationships, as much as our understanding, are at the heart of what we're doing here. I've been asked to say just a brief word about our next dialogue on divinity, at which I'll be in the hot seat alongside Sister Estelle Sogbu of the community of Shem Neuf, where we'll be speaking about the relationship between ecumenism and liberation, two heady concepts that are often misunderstood, but I think that we'll see that healing histories of mistrust and violence and dismantling unjust and cruel structures and systems are very much in harmony with one another. And this is going to be the topic of our next one. So please do come back on March 24th and again in May for our third. It's a wonderful opportunity to continue having these conversations and growing these relationships. Thank you again, and thank you again for being here.
So, Dr. Levine, you of course have spent...
If you call me Dr. Levine one more time, I will throw these tulips at you.
All right.
Please call me AJ.
So, Dr. Levine, well, now see, we've gotten off to her telling an untruth. So how do we know that the rest of this is going to be true? So, AJ, you have spent most of your life, most of your academic career in the classroom. And a great deal of that time has oddly, very oddly, been spent teaching ministerial students for Christian denominations. So I wondered, how has anti-Semitism shown itself in your work in the seminary classroom? What is it? Why is it a problem? What are some examples of it?
How much time do we have? Hi, can you all hear okay? If I say anything that strikes you as unhelpful or unclear, please ask me about it, or if we're done today, you can always write to me, care of my Vanderbilt University address. I want you to be challenged, but I don't want you to be upset with me. So if there's anything I can do to be of help to you, I would be happy to do that. All right, so what I get from my students, I spent 9 years at Swarthmore College, good liberal arts school, teaching Bible. I was Bible lady. Close to 30 years at Vanderbilt, and now at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. So my job as a Jew is to teach Christians, Jews, and Muslims how to read the New Testament without religious bigotry. This is hard. So my students come in with stereotypes. They think all Jews are rich, we should be so lucky. They think we run the world, we should be so lucky. They think we want to run the world. I personally don't. That's well above anything that I ever had in mind. So they have all sorts of unfortunate stereotypes, some of which are complimentary, like you're all smart. You know, we're just people like everybody else on the range. When it comes to the New Testament, the Christian Bible Part 2, has some very, very problematic material in it. So does Christian Bible Part 1, what the church would call the Old Testament, what the synagogue would call the Tanakh, like commandments in Deuteronomy to wipe out the Canaanites, for example. It's just really hard stuff, misogynistic stuff in the prophet Ezekiel. But what the Jewish community has learned how to do is engage in alternative textual interpretation. So that we have something called midrash, a story based on the text. For example, it could have been the case that Jews should have hated Egyptians, right? 400 years of slavery followed by genocide. It's not a great history. But we have a midrash that says when the children of Israel are fleeing through the sea and the waters part, you can see this by Cecil B. DeMille, who did it very, very well, and the waters come back and they engulf the Egyptian troops that are trying to catch them. And the angels, according to the midrash, start singing to God, you know, your children are free. This is terrific. They can't find God, which is awkward. And they eventually find God sitting in a corner, wrapped in a tallit, wrapped in a prayer shawl, and weeping. And the angels are saying, this is a time to sing praises. And God responds, you're singing praises and my children are dying. And he's talking about the Egyptians. So we have these midrashic controls to help us with some of the more difficult material. What I want to see is Christians have have material for that. So they come in. In many churches this morning, the reading would have been Luke chapter 4, the Jesus synagogue sermon. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Okay. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus talks about how the predictions in Isaiah about how somebody, and Jesus says it is he, who has been commissioned to give sight to the blind and freedom to the oppressed. And then he says, but by the way, there were many widows in Israel, but Elijah the prophet only went to the widow in Zarephath, Gentile town. And there were many people suffering skin disease in Israel, but Elisha the prophet only cured Naaman the Syrian general. And then I started reading this morning, as I am wont to do on Sunday morning, interpretations of this text. Oh, the Jews don't take care of widows, and Jesus is condemning them for that. The Jews think that if you're sick, you're sinful, and Jesus is decoupling. So all of this negative and false anti-Semitic stereotype is finding its way into the interpretations of Luke, which means when people leave the church after hearing one of these sermons, not yours, they're going to hate Jews because they're going to think of Jews as only caring about the healthy and the wealthy. That's the standard interpretation that I get. That Old Testament is all about law and the New Testament is all about grace. That Judaism, which to them means the Old Testament, is all about vindictive violence, whereas the New Testament is about restorative justice. They apparently never caught a glimpse of the book of Revelation, which is a little bit more violent. That Jews think that only Jews are saved, but we have strongly encoded in the tradition that God is the God of everybody, because that's how Genesis starts. So that God is the God of everybody. We just don't think you need to be Jewish in order to be in a right relationship with God, because Jews are an ethnic group. It's kind of like being Irish or being German or being Kenyan or whatever. You don't have to be that in order to be in a right relationship with God. So all these negative stereotypes keep coming in, and what makes it worse in more or less liberal Christian congregations, okay, so you know who you voted for, this will tell you which one you're in, that for people who have a hard time with the supernatural aspects of the Bible, God becoming flesh, walking on water, raising the dead, coming back to life, ascending up into heaven and coming back, all that supernatural stuff is difficult for some people. But how does then one remain within a Christian context? Well, make first century Judaism look like the worst thing that ever happened. And then anytime Jesus does something we like, he becomes unique. So Jesus invents rights for women in the pantsuit over against misogynistic Judaism. And Jesus invents concern for the poor over against elitist, wealthy Judaism. And Jesus invents health care over against Jews who toss the sick out onto the street. So it's weak Christology. It's not having enough faith in the tradition, and it's not having any knowledge of first century Judaism that allows some of these negative stereotypes to pop in. And they're all over the place, and they don't realize they're saying these things. So the vast majority of anti-Semitic stuff I've heard coming from preachers and priests and pastors and religious educators is not because the individual doing the speaking is a bigot consciously. It's because of tone deafness, the simple inability to hear something that's offensive. And this is part of human conditions. And when I call them on it, I try to call in rather than call out, because you don't want to say, boy, that was a stupid sermon. That's not a good conversation starter. To say, perhaps we could have phrased this otherwise. Generally, people are responsive, but sometimes I get what's called fragility. And we know this from studies of race. I didn't mean it. You're overreacting. Nobody was listening anyway. Horrible thing for a pastor to say. There are other things that are more important. So you get this kind of deflection rather than dealing with the mess that's there.
Could we dig just a bit into deeper? So I'd like to go back to what you began with. When you talked about Midrash and the Exodus event.
Yeah.
So we can go lots of different directions, but let's do this. I would suspect that there are a great many Christians in America who would say, well, that's ridiculous because that's not in the Bible. the Bible is what it is, and it says what it says, and this is literally true, and what you just told us about is just a fantasy.
Yeah.
So I wonder, because you've taught in interdenominational seminaries, especially at Vanderbilt, what about the issue of sort of biblical literalism? I mean, how does that impact how people read the Bible with regard to anything, but especially with regard to Jews?
Yeah. So for those people who want to insist that if you have something called a red letter Bible where all the words of Jesus are written in red letters, that he actually said and did everything that the Bible says he said and did, you still need interpretation. Fundamentalists are not all literalists. A literalist reading would be if your eye offends you, pluck it out. And I'm not seeing a lot of Christians walking around with eye patches, right? If your hand offends you, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off, which seems a little odd because if it's already causing you to stumble, whacking would be even more of a problem. They're not doing that. Sell all you have and give to the poor. Okay, that's a one-off, but most people aren't doing that. So everybody has to figure out how to do interpretation. Everybody interprets. And even if we have the word on the page, that doesn't tell us how the sentence was expressed. Facetiously, with a smile. Jesus says to this poor Canaanite mother with a demon-possessed daughter, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Well, did he say that with a smile on his lips and a twinkle in his eye, or did he just say, get out of here, you bitch, which is what calling somebody a dog is? So we have to figure out how this is being said. That's interpretation, right? And if the Bible simply is what it is and we don't need it to be interpreted, then all clergy are now out of business. Because you got nothing to say. We already know what it means. So we have to do this anyway. And the weird thing here, because he's back in the news, is that people watched Mel Gibson, the Passion of the Christ, and said that's exactly what happened. And I'm looking at the text going, no, he didn't invent the table. There are certain things that are not there. But that's how sermons work. That's how Bible movies work. That's how The Chosen works. For those of you who have been watching The Chosen, it's like you're there. No, you're not there. It's all interpretation.
But the way Mel Gibson portrays the resurrection is exactly the way the people who saw it happen described it.
Nobody commented on the fact that he wasn't wearing anything. I mean, that's where you start.
I just find it so interesting that one thing the Bible doesn't do is talk about what happened at the resurrection, and that's such a central part of that.
Yep.
So in fact, even people who pretend to be very true to the text aren't actually necessarily being that true to the text. So there, as you said, there's always an interpretation.
Right, and it's also a matter of the text doesn't tell us everything.
Right.
Right, so we know that Jesus ate a lot, but what was on the table?
Right.
We know that he had numerous encounters, more miracles than can possibly be told, as the Gospel of John tells us. Wonder what some of those others were. So it's easier if you're Anglican and you've got or Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox and you've got a history of ongoing interpretation. Mm-hmm. If you're low church Protestant, it's a little bit harder. But even with my more Protestant fundamentalist students, how do you understand the story? Why is it being told? Mm-hmm. How would you explain it to somebody who's not part of the Christian tradition? What new words would you use? Mm-hmm. And alongside of that, look at various interpretations, because people will interpret based on where they come from. So if you come from if you come from a position of poverty, you might interpret a text differently than if you come from a position of wealth, or what part of the world you come from, or how your body functions, or what your performance says. Look at these other interpretations. We're never going to get it all. This is Paul through a mirror dimly or through a glass darkly. We're never going to get it all till, the great by and by. I can wait on that. But we can work with each other to try to get a more fulsome knowledge.
But how about anti-Semitism? How does this sort of literalism or fundamentalism, whatever you want to call it, how does this interact with the issues of anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Because again, even if you have a more literalist or conservative view, you might have a different approach toward Jews. So for my more conservative Protestant students, Jews are the chosen people and the Old Testament is important. So for both reasons, they tend to read with a little bit more grace. For my liberal Protestants who know nothing about the Old Testament except for maybe Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark, which they remember from when they were children in Sunday school or vacation Bible school, their knowledge of Jews is Old Testament God of wrath and contemporary policy in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And not much else. Mm-hmm. So even that liberal, conservative, literalist, non-literalist divide sometimes it gets a little bit messy when we start looking at questions of anti-Semitism.
Well, then why don't we look at liberal Protestantism? So, of course, everyone brings a hermeneutic to the text. Everyone has an interpretive method they bring to the text, whether they know it or not. So if we know that theoretically there are certain kinds of people who say what it says on the page is what it is. I've read the Old Testament. I know about Jews, their law, Christians are grace, I mean, all of that. But there have to be hermeneutics that your more liberal students bring to the text. I mean, I think, for example, of, I don't know, ableism, for example, sort of an ableistic reading of the text or a womanist reading of the text. Or, I mean, there's so many of those right now. How does that play into how people read the Christian Bible or the entire Bible, and how does that come to bear on issues of anti-Semitism?
Yeah. So there are a number of, we might call them affinity group readings. So you read from your own subject position, your own social location, and you read in community. And we do this all the time because we're already part of different groups. What I'm finding increasingly in these affinity-based groups is Judaism epitomizes the problem and Jesus represents the solution. So for ableism, Jews tossed out the sick and Jesus welcomes them in. Or Jews would have prevented Jesus from healing on the Sabbath, and Jesus says, well, of course we would heal on the Sabbath. What they forget here is the healing is a miracle, right? Because most of the people who are doing such readings are not going to say, gee, if you're a surgeon and you come into church on a Sunday morning and the person sitting next to you has a non-painful chronic condition, you're not going to stop after the first hymn and say, here, let's leave the church and we'll go do the hand operation. What you're likely to get is, call my office tomorrow morning, and by the way, do you have health insurance? When Jesus heals people, generally, somebody complains in a synagogue on the Sabbath. Look, any synagogue meeting on the Sabbath, any church meeting on Sunday, somebody's going to complain about something. They're professionals, right? And it's too cold. The choir was off. The sermon was too long. The sermon was too short. You don't get that often, but sometimes. You're in my seat.
Since 1984, I have never gotten that one.
It may come at some point, trust. I didn't like what the rabbi said about, or he forgot to mention my father's yard site, or whatever it was. Somebody's going to complain. But generally, when Jesus heals people in the synagogue on the Sabbath, the congregation gives glory to God. And why not? Because free health care is a miracle. We should all give glory to God. So even with the ableism issue, we still wind up setting up a negative over against which Jesus can prove the positive. Generally, when I hear in a sermon that Jesus did something radical, that's one of those buzzwords. What exactly is radical about healing? Well, Elijah, Elisha, rabbinic miracle workers, and so on. What's radical about debating other Jews about how to follow Torah? Jews have been doing that since Moses came down the mountain and said, 6 days you can work, the Sabbath is a day of rest for you, it should be holy, don't work. One Jew looks at another and says, what constitutes work? Now you have two synagogues. So these are things that we have always debated about. Jesus isn't being radical there. Jesus is radical when he says things like, love your enemies. That's pretty radical. Something Christians have a somewhat hard time doing. Jews are not commanded to love our enemies. We are commanded that if our enemies are hungry, we have to feed them. And if our enemies are lost, we have to show them the right road. And if they lose a donkey, we have to reach them. We have to act decently to them. Loving them is well above my pay grade. That's where Jesus gets radical. We don't have that. Jesus says things like you have to hate your mother and your father, your kids, in order to have a part of it. Jews don't say that. I'm a mother. There's no way my kids are going to hate me. Absolutely not. So let's get the radical stuff where it fits historically and not have to invent a negative Judaism over against which to make Jesus look all bright and shiny. I think he looks I like Jesus a lot. I don't worship him as Lord and Savior because I've never felt that call. I mean, my heart's completely filled in my own synagogue system. But boy, he was smart. And he's worth paying attention to, and he's a fabulous teacher. And I don't think you need to make Judaism look bad in order to make him look good, so I don't know why Christians keep doing that.
Well, of course, nobody in this room knows either, but we do. So, ableism.
Yeah.
Ableism, feminism, womanism, all of it. All of it is somehow, to my mind, because I finished school a long time ago when a lot of these methods were simply not in the air. But as I hear people using these methods, joining these affinity groups, sort of a common thread, I think, in many of them is liberation, equality, equity, human dignity, all of these sorts of things. That you read the text through that lens. It would seem to me then that all of these schools of thought would inherently be pro-Semitic and anti-Semitic because they're about liberation. That's where I'm not quite grasping what's happening here. So ableism, you gave one, but I mean, if I'm a womanist, for example, how is it that I'm not going to read the text in a way that helps to see the equality, the dignity, and the liberation of Jews?
If you're not that familiar with the entire biblical tradition, so you're coming in not as a biblical scholar, but you're coming in from a particular philosophical perspective or a particular contemporary sociological perspective, then that absence of knowledge is going to get flooded in with negative stereotype. It's just easy to do. If you want liberation, and this is a potential problem for all of liberation theology. Liberation theology I really like because I like using the Bible to diagnose social problems and then trying to think our way through to what a solution might be. The earlier texts like the Gospel of Saul and Tanami is a really good example of that. But liberation theology is often politically based and it's liberation from something. So if you want to do liberation from something and you're looking at the Bible and you're looking at Jesus as your go-to New Testament figure, then the liberation has to be, you're liberated from Jewish context because Jesus doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about Rome. Mm-hmm. And it's a whole lot easier to talk about the Jews than it is to talk about the empire. Mm-hmm. There's also the question about how exactly bad the Roman Empire was. Do you remember this old movie, Monty Python's Life of Brian? Mm-hmm. Like, what have the Romans done for us? Well, they built the aqueduct and the roads are safe, right? So it's just easier to go after these magical Jews who represent everything that's wrong, and today it's even easier because of contemporary issues in the Middle East.
So Jews are racist. Jesus frees us from racism. Jews are misogynistic. Jesus frees women.
Right. Jews want a warrior Messiah, and they rejected Jesus because he talked about peace. Jews are xenophobic, and Jesus invents the United Nations. Jews like the wealthy, and Jesus likes the poor. Jews like people to suffer, and Jesus invents health care. And so on, because it's that liberation from something which winds up getting purchased in the church context. And if the only people you're talking to happen to be Christians, they might not hear the problem. In the same way that people who code white don't recognize our own implicit racism, or people who are able-bodied don't recognize even the terms that we use. So even in something like the New Testament, when Jesus says if a blind person leads a blind person, they're both going to fall into a ditch. No, they're not blind. People know what they're doing. They have sticks. They know the roads. That's an ableist comment. So that becomes, that's what Jews think. So it's expedient and it's easy. And then when I point out to people, well, this is anti-Semitic, then I start getting that fragility model in. And when I hear it from people, because I read very, very widely, so when I read this stuff in publications from the World Council of Churches or from international gatherings, then I get, they don't know any Jews. They didn't mean it as if they need to be treated with kid gloves rather than just say anti-Semitism is bad, like racism is bad and ableism is bad. And it doesn't matter who says it. It ought not to be said. It should be corrected gently and kindly, but corrected nevertheless.
So let's talk about grace and works.
Okay.
So for those of us Christians in the room here, I suspect that I would think that most of the Christians in the room today are Anglicans. I would think a lot of us are, right? And you mentioned earlier Anglicanism, Orthodoxy, and Roman Catholicism. For us, the grace works thing is really not such a line in the sand. I mean, we come from a long tradition where that sort of dichotomy is it's not exactly the way we think of things, But it is the way a lot of Christians think. Certainly after Luther, I mean, that was that strong dichotomy. So how does that play out with your students? So, how are you saved, by grace or by works? And Jews, of course, think you've got to earn your salvation. God is very angry with you Jews until you do the right thing. And then for us, God is angry with us too, but we have grace, so it's okay. I mean, how do you parse the grace works thing with your students, or how do you parse it in general?
Well, I have to introduce it to my Catholic students because they don't have this. They read the Epistle of James. They think it's great. James says faith without works is dead. I want that on samplers on every single church in the world. It would be great. Anglican's not a problem. Eastern Orthodox not a problem because it's grace along with works. It's a joint thing. You put in your effort, God puts in the divine effort, and somehow it all works out. So the problem is primarily with Protestants. And this is from Martin Luther, who decided, there's nothing we can do to earn God's love. It's all about grace. If he had just said that to a group of Jews, if he actually talked with us rather than about us, everything would have been fine because the Jews would have said, yeah, absolutely. We don't follow Torah in order to earn God's love. That's how we got the Torah in the first place. So he's got the cart before the horse. God gives us the Torah out of grace, and our response is we follow it because this is how we respond to that divine love. The model is similar to if you get married, generally in the West, you get married because of love, right? Not because mommy and daddy signed a contract. You get married because of love. And there are certain things you do in that relationship to enhance the love. And you have positive commandments and negative commandments. So with me and my partner, almost 40 years now, there are positive commandments like thou shalt remember thy anniversary. Mm-hmm. Right? They're important things like that. Mm-hmm. There are negative commandments. Thou shalt not leave the seat up at night. Right? Because you do that. Now, the partner does not do this to earn my love. He's already got that. He does that because it enhances the relationship. And every once in a while, he finds other things to do to enhance the relationship. My mother had one. My mother said, never go to bed angry. And I think that's a pretty good commandment. Not to earn the love, but to enhance the relationship. And that's why Jews follow Torah, is to enhance the relationship. I think Jesus would have said basically the same thing at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which I don't think he gave, by the way. It's 3 chapters. I mean, the disciples, their heads would have exploded at the end of Matthew 5. They never would have made it to chapter 7. And it's somewhat incoherent. But at the end he says, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. It's a kind of interesting perfectionism model for those of you who left the Anglican Church to go be Methodist. I mean, it's a little perfectionist model here. Yes, I'm fluent in Protestant.
I know you are. You're amazing. You even know about Mormons, which is
I do know about Mormons. And then you have to worry about the Book of Mormon, so you just add on additional texts. You all got the Apocrypha, there's all sorts of stuff to worry about. So what's he doing? He says, when I would come from school when I was a kid, and I was such a good girl. I would get an A, because I was good in school. My mother would say, why didn't you get an A+? I'd get 100 on a math test. Why didn't you get 105? Because it wasn't there. You could have done better. That's that be perfect. Why set the bar low? Set it as high as you can. That's also a very Jewish thing to do. But it's not a law grace thing. That's something Martin Luther more or less came up with. And when we get a sense of reading Paul talking about works righteousness, what we forget with Paul is that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. And he's telling these Gentiles, pagans, non-Jews, non-Samaritans, listen, you don't have to do all those Jewy things like circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary regulation, because that's not for you. Those are for the Jews. And that's designed to keep them as a holy nation. This is Leviticus 19. You become ex-pagan pagans. This is language from my friend Paula Fredrickson. You become ex-pagan pagans. You stop worshiping your own gods. That was a political problem right there, right? Telling somebody you can't worship your own gods anymore. Whoa. And you worship the God of Israel, and you behave kindly and gently toward everybody else. But it's not works righteousness the way Luther plays it out, because Luther forgets that Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles and thinks Paul's the apostle to everybody.
Well, when you talk about Luther, then, I mean, what did Luther think? I mean, just for those of us who really aren't that conversant.
Well, it depends upon the Luther that you get. There's early Luther and there's late Luther. Earlier is better. Okay. Early Luther wrote this great text called Why Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. Because Luther's idea was that the Roman Catholic Church had treated the Jews so terribly that if they simply got the Lutheran brand, which he would not have called Lutheran, but I'll credit him with that, if they got his brand of reformation, he didn't call himself Protestant either. That's a term that got lobbed onto them by the Roman Catholics. They called themselves reformers. So if they simply got this Reformation way of reading, of course they would become Christian. The problem is, we didn't. And then Luther decided, well, if we can't respond to Christian grace, then obviously we must be children of the devil, and therefore our Talmud should be burned, and we should be kicked out of countries and whatever. So it depends upon the Luther that you want. Luther is an Augustinian monk, was going through all these rituals, hoping that he could find himself in a right relationship with God, and he's trying and he's trying and he's trying, and he's not getting anywhere. And he sits down and he reads Romans about justification by faith, and he says, oh, that's it. I don't have to do anything. It's all divine grace. Now, what comes after that, by the way, and this is Luther, good works, sexist language, good works don't make a good man, but a good man bears good fruit. So the idea was that after you accept Christ in your heart and you get all this divine grace shed on you and all this other stuff, you're just supposed to be a lovely, wonderful, gracious, full, compassionate person for the rest of your life. Luther had a bit of a hard time with that. Yeah? So what do we have? We have two systems that don't work perfectly. Jews are supposed to follow Torah in response to God's love, but we don't always do it. Christians, in response to divine grace, are supposed to engage in good works, but they don't always do it. So we can always be better than we are. And we're also both unfinished products, right? The church is waiting for the Messiah to come back. The Jews are waiting for the Messiah to come. After which it'll all get sorted out. Neither one of us will need a job anymore.
Neither one of us will be alive when that happens, truth be told.
Oh, there are some standing here who might not taste death before they see the kingdom and God come in power.
That was really beautiful. We should put that like on a postcard or something.
This is not bad.
No,
It's not bad.
you really have a way with words. Hey, look, friends. So we're now about 35, 40 minutes in, and we decided at this point we're going to stop, and we're going to give you a chance to write on your paper things that you would like for Dr. Levine to think about with us, talk about. So why don't we just pause for a bit, and so you can write your notes, which is what our organizers here in Shem and Nif and the community at the Crossing have asked that we do. And then some folks will come along and collect them, and they'll sort them, and then we'll dig in again.
While they're writing, can I talk about why bad stuff keeps happening?
Sure.
Okay, so you write, I'll talk, because then we won't waste time in case you don't have anything to write. Why does this happen? Because the Association of Theological Schools, which is the major accrediting organization for divinity schools and seminaries in the US and Canada, does not require any targeted instruction to avoid anti-Semitism. And I've been asking them to put in something since 2006, and they refuse. That's one reason. Because if seminaries and divinity schools aren't required to teach it, they're not going to. Because there are lots of statements. From the Anglican Church, God's Unfailing Word that came out in 2019, it's a wonderful statement. I think it's also 109 pages long. People usually want a page and a half at most. So by the time you're done with 109 pages, you forgot where you were. And it's Anglican, so it could be this and it could be that. It's very gracious, but other than saying you should pay attention, this is good. Lectionaries. Lectionaries, it's the Parsha HaShavua in the churches, in mainline churches. And a number of the lectionary readings set up a negative Old Testament over against a positive New Testament, so that's not helpful. The problem of contemporary Middle Eastern politics trying to find its way into sermons. And it's really hard to resolve Middle Eastern politics in an 11-minute sermon. Right? We also have to announce who gave the flowers and who died. Problems of tone deafness, of inability of people to listen, part of the general culture. The discipline of biblical studies itself, which was founded by a group of German anti-Semites who talked about the time of Judaism. The German term is Spätjudentum, late Judaism. And this is supersessionism proper, because everything the New Testament has to be new and shiny and great, rather than, oh, where's concern for the poor show up? Deuteronomy. You will always have the poor with you, so extend your hand to the poor and needy. Which can forget about all that stuff. So it's bad education, it's position statements that don't work down to the clergy, let alone to the laity. It's people unwilling to listen. And I think part of it is not enough people are putting in the corrections. So I every day, pretty much, I'm writing brief emails to people saying, could you rephrase that? Could you do something better? Here's a different resource you might use. And I'm tired, and I want other people to do this. Inducing guilt, inducing guilt.
I remember I used to teach and was the dean of General Seminary downtown. And I remember when we went through ATS accreditation, it was awful. It's an awful ordeal. The Association of Theological Schools. But the one thing I was very grateful for, not about the ATS, but about those days, is we had a strong, intact, 3-year residential seminary program. And one of the things that scares me right now is that a great deal of seminary education, at least in the United States, is now being done remotely, non-residentially, and I wonder about, first of all, I wonder about the quality. You're worried about them getting training in anti-Semitism. I'm worried about them getting training in much of anything,
Fair
to be
enough.
honest. But second of all, I would think that's one thing. But let's look at real solid residential academic seminaries. Now, I would think the fact that in seminary you're required to take extensive training in both Testaments to be able to read Hebrew, to be able to read Greek. I think that just simply by going through that exercise, you'd be forced to confront the text as it actually is and not be given to these anti-Semitic stereotypes. So why doesn't, the requirement certainly that every seminary has, that you read Latin and Greek and take numerous courses in both Testaments, why doesn't that touch this?
Because most seminaries, you're not required to do any of those foreign languages. Methodists don't require their candidates for ordained ministry, deacons or elders, to know any foreign languages. Some churches only require one. Presbyterians require both, but it's get through the exam and then you probably forget it as you move on. Lutherans usually one, should be two, but the students aren't learning as much as they should. But even if you learn the languages, it may not help you because bad texts are still bad texts. Or difficult texts are still difficult texts. When the Gospel of John has Jesus say to the Jews, "You Jews are children of the devil," it's just as bad in Greek as it is in English, in pretty much every other language, so we still have to deal with the interpretation. I'm seeing in a number of seminary contexts now, and with a number of seminarians, the idea that we ought not to have to do history at all, because history is written by the historical winners. As one student put it, history is bunk. I reminded her that she was citing Henry Ford. She said, "Who's he?" So this already tells you there's a problem with history, because if we don't know history, this is Santayana, we're going to repeat it anyway. Or history is elitist, because you need to know foreign languages, and that puts you up above everybody else, and the Bible should be open to everybody. So it's whatever translation you want to use is just fine. Reader's Digest condensed version, fine. Good news for modern man, fine. Doesn't matter. So even seminary training is iffy, and for the ATS requirements, you have to have a course in Bible. But nobody says it has to be an historical course. You can have an entire course in the Bible and post-colonial theory, and that'll do it for you. And what does that tell you about first century Judea and Galilee? Nothing.
Before we go on, you mentioned the Gospel of John, and I think we have to talk about the Gospel of John. But I want to so this is Dr. Levine's new book on the Gospel of John, a wonderful book. And the reason I bring this up is because it's in our bookstore. Buy it. And then
Well, you could do a whole unit on it with your congregation, and they could all buy it.
Your whole congregation can buy it in our bookstore. Jesus for everyone.
Not just Christians.
Not just Christians. And then this is something that I used when I was in seminary, the marvelous mustard seed. This is what we used when we studied the Bible. No, not really. But this is very much worth it. So all of these books are in our bookstore, as well as many other wonderful things. But I recommend these two in particular. It was very, very graciously Dr. Levine, when she published the Gospel of John, asked me to be one of the recommenders, the people who write the blurbs. I wonder if my blurb is on the back. Yes, it is. I've only read it online. I got the proofs. Well, there I am. And I get a cut for every one of these you buy. No, I really don't. I really don't. So let's talk about the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
So as you know, you talked about our lectionary. We tend to read the Gospel of John, not exclusively, but almost, during the Easter season, and also during Holy Week and the Easter season. And in particular, we read the Johannine Passion account on Good Friday, which is, when I hear that text, I do not hear it as anti-Semitic because I sort of understand the whole context. But on the face of it, it's pretty anti-Semitic. And I wonder if you could talk about anti-Semitism in the Gospel of John, various examples, and in particular the Passion account, which is difficult for us. And for those of you who are not members of the Episcopal Church or churches that use the lectionary that we and all the other mainline churches use, at least our tradition, our church, has actually issued documentation on how preachers are to approach the Gospel of John, especially on Good Friday, because the text is so problematic. So there have actually been suggestions that we simply stop reading it. We simply don't read the Gospel of John, especially the Passion accounts, in our churches. But I think that would be a huge mistake. But we are sort of counseled on how to approach those texts. So I wonder, Dr. Levine, if you could talk about the Johannine anti-Semitism, and in particular the Passion accounts. What's John talking about when he talks about the Jews?
I think John's talking about the Jews. I really do. The Greek term, the New Testament is written in Greek. The Greek word normally translated Jew is Judaios, the plural is Judaioi. You can translate it Judeans, it's a legitimate translation. But if you take all the examples of the Gospel of John where the Jews are used and you say Judeans, it doesn't help very much. First of all, the congregation knows you're talking about Jews. And if somebody says, well, who are the Judeans and why do we care about them? Well, it must be the Jews or it's irrelevant. I think what John wants to do is distance whoever's going to read the Gospel of John from any group or any synagogal context that would call themselves Jews, to say, we are not them. A Canadian scholar named Adele Reinhardt wrote a book a couple of years ago called Cast Out of the Covenant, and she thinks that's what John has done vis-a-vis Jewish communities other than those who believe the way John does. And I think John is also setting up a different way of existing in the world. So generally we exist because of the group into which we are born or the location where we were born. So like we're American citizens or we're Canadian citizens or whatnot. Jews are Jews from Jewish parentage. At the time of Jesus, father definitely, and if father's not clear, then mother. So you're a Jew because you come out of a Jewish womb, in effect. And John says, and this is John chapter 3, where Jesus is chatting with a Pharisee named Nicodemus, you have to be born from above. You have to be born anew. The only people who are children of God are the people that God calls, and that's not everybody in the Gospel of John. So John's very dualistic and very deterministic, and there are the Jews over here who represent the world and its bad, and yes, God so loved us, but even so. At the end, the Jews are basically children of the devil rather than children of God, and I think that's what John means. And that's why we need Christian Midrash to help us say, do we really want to say that? Because we're all part of God's children. We're all in the image and likeness of God. We're not in the likeness of Satan. In 2015, one of the ordination exams for the Episcopal Church, this church, was you have a congregant who's married to a Jew who came to church on Good Friday and heard those Holy Week readings and wrote in to you and said, I'm really concerned about this as an anti-Semitic message. Write a response. What a fabulous ordination question. Deal with it. And a couple of years ago...
I was on the board that wrote the question.
Good for you. The Episcopal Church, good for you. Like you even more. The Episcopal Church actually had hearings on whether to change the Holy Week readings or not. Because I got to testify. They gave me 2 minutes, and I timed it out perfectly, and then they said, read more slowly because we're doing simultaneous translation in Spanish. So I got most of it out. And people responded, no, we can't change it. Why can't we change it? Because it's what we've always done. No, it's not. That's why it's called the Revised Common Lecture. Revised before. Or because people like it this way. As if anti-Semitism is okay as long as we like it? Yeah. Do something about it. Because if people keep saying, we know it's bad, but we're going to keep it in place anyway, guidelines can be helpful, but I'm not sure the guidelines have worked. And the reason I'm not sure they've worked is because every Easter I get emails from Episcopal priests saying, help. Mm-hmm. You know what I'd like to see if I ruled the world? The U.S. what's called the Black Church, multiple denominations, has a tradition of doing the 7 last words of Jesus on Good Friday, where you can pull from all 4 Gospels. And these are things like, Father, forgive them, or my God, why have you forsaken me, or Son, behold your mother, mother, behold your... These wonderful verses. And if they're only going to go to church on Christmas, Good Friday, and Easter, you might as well get all 4 Gospels in. I would like to see that better. I think that would be more helpful. Or at the very least, if you read the text, have a little brochure giving little footnotes saying, here's the possible historical circumstances under which this text took place. Here is the way this text has been interpreted over time. Please don't go there. So there are mechanisms.
So, believing, as you seem to, that John really is anti-Semitic,
yeah.
Do we simply abandon the 4th Gospel? Do we abandon it?
No, not at all. I think much of Deuteronomy is anti-Canaanite. I think parts of the prophets are anti pretty much everybody out there before they get around to hauling off on Israel. I think Ezekiel is misogynist. You don't throw it out, because you don't throw out your history. If you throw out your history, you're going to go repeat it anyway. I want it there with footnotes. I want it there with education to say, we did some horrible things in our past, and that's what atonement is for. That's what grace is for. And we may not be personally responsible for it, but it's part of our tradition, and I'd like to acknowledge it and then move on from there, rather than just say we were perfect since day one. So no, I don't want to throw it out at all. But I also think that one needs to be a little bit more careful in the Christian context, where not the entire Bible is read on Sunday morning. You pick and choose. I mean, you've got a bigger Bible than we do, so you've got more to read. But not everything needs to be read, and not everything needs to be read on a Sunday morning. So what is it that needs to be proclaimed to the people who are actually going to show up on Sunday? And that may be where some changes could be helpful.
You know, in the Anglican tradition, we actually, if you do it all, morning and evening prayer every day and the Eucharist on Sunday, you actually do get the Bible every year. But man, is it a haul. I mean, when I was at the seminary, and we would read morning prayer and evening prayer every single day, a chapter by chapter by chapter. It is a lot of text, and it is a lot of difficult text. But you're right, when you do that, and then you only go to church on Sunday, you realize what a tiny little selection of the text you're actually getting.
Right, and if you do it in a prayer context where you're in community, then when you leave the service, you can talk to the person you were sitting next to. What did you think about that verse? That made me really uncomfortable. Yeah, how might we do that otherwise? But that doesn't generally happen on a Sunday morning. When you leave church, the question is, where are we going to go for brunch? So perhaps a little bit of finagling or moving things around. Yes, this is important because it's all important. But Jesus talks, and this is Jewish tradition, there are some commandments that are more weighty than others. Jews use the same thing. We talk about heavy and light commandments. I want some of the more heavy stuff to be on Sunday morning, and some of the lighter stuff can be on Tuesday.
I think that you talked about reading the scripture in the liturgical assembly, in a community context. I think, again, for those of us who are Anglicans or Roman Catholics or Orthodox Christians, that's simply the way we do it. And we not only do it in the context of reading it in community, but we also think about reading it in the context of 2,000 years, well, even more, of community. You know, this is not my text. This is our text. We created this thing. We made it up. It's ours. But that's not, I do not think, that is the way that most American Christians, at least, understand how one reads the Bible. And I think that leads to a great deal of dangerous interpretation or misinterpretation. So I wonder if you could, again, having taught for so many years in an interdenominational seminary, could you say something about how the students you've encountered imagine how one engages the text? And I don't mean, specific hermeneutic approaches, but how does one engage the text in the mind of most of the students you've met over your many years in academia?
Yeah, or how to help them engage the text and sometimes break them of bad habits. Because some of the bad habits is I have to memorize every word. Well, that's great, but if you don't do any interpretation, then it's a good memory exercise, but after that, you're not going to get very far. For Bible reading in general, for anybody, seminarians, laity, clergy, whoever, the best way to start is you pick up a text and you ask yourself, what does this text mean to me? Because at this point, you can't get it wrong. So you're already, to use the baseball image, ahead of the curve, like you know where you got something. It could be dreadfully wrong, but you got something. But don't stop there. What does it mean to my neighbors? What does it mean to my teacher? What does it mean to my dentist? I mean, my poor dentist who's Hindu, like I ask him, what do you think about this? Because I figure he's a captive audience too. What has it meant to people in my tradition in the past? And you go to the library. What might the original have been? And then you go to the Greek or the Hebrew. So you start with what does it mean to me, but then you broaden out. And if it's a text that might have implications for a group that's not us, then you go find somebody in the group that's not us. Say, how does this hit you? When I first started getting some of this quite hardcore anti-Semitic reading from some of my students at Vanderbilt, both of my kids went to the Akiva School, the Orthodox Jewish Day School in Nashville. And they had Passover off in the springtime, which was Intro New Testament. So I would bring my kids to my classroom because I didn't have daycare, right? So they're going to be there anyway. So here's my son, Alex. He's now a librarian. Who knew? He's on the front lines. With his kippah and his tzitzit, his little big chubby cheeks. And I would put him in front of my students and I would say, when you're teaching or preaching, I want you to picture this child in the front pew. And do not say anything that will hurt this child, and do not say anything that will cause a member of your congregation to hurt this child. That is theatrical and manipulative, but it's really effective. And I said, if that doesn't work, picture me in the back pew. Because if I hear something that I find to deform the gospel, I care enough about it that I'm going to be standing up in the back of your church. And the last thing you want is an angry middle-aged Jewish woman standing in the back of your church. Yeah. And that works as well. So try to picture other people who may be out there for the first time, or try to imagine that the person with whom you're having a conversation may not have the same religious perspective that you do. You still have to speak. So speak your truth, but be aware that there may be a response that you're not anticipating. And if you're in the pulpit, try to judge what that is.
This puts me in mind of something that I discovered this week as people responded to Bishop Marianne Buddy's sermon at the Washington Cathedral on the day after the inauguration. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. But the Bishop of Washington is a woman named Marianne Buddy. In the past, the prayer service on the day after the inauguration has been orchestrated by the government, but it's always been in our cathedral in Washington. And this year we said, nope, if it's going to be in our cathedral, it's going to be our service. And you're welcome to come, but this is a cathedral. It's the cathedral of the nation, but it's the bishop's church, and we're planning the service. And so they did. And then she preached. And it was a lovely sermon until the end, when it got even more lovely, when Bishop Buddy asked Mr. Trump not to change his mind about anything, but to have mercy on people. And she said, imagine the frightened, LGBTQ youth. Imagine the frightened child who thinks their parents are going to be deported. Imagine their anguish, and have mercy. Notice she didn't say, we don't need borders, or we don't need immigration laws, or you've got to think that, gay sex is the greatest thing ever. She just said, have mercy. And the pushback was incredible. And one of the things that I began reading about, which startled me, but it gets back to imagining the middle-aged Jewish woman in the back row, was Christians of a certain sort saying, we must not give in to the heresy of empathy. It's the devil's work. The devil wants us to feel sorry for people so that we don't do the right thing. We can't have empathy for people. It's very problematic. And so when you told the story, imagine little Alex, right? Imagine me. Think of Alex and be tender. Think of me and be frightened. This school of thought would say, you're doing the devil's work. You're asking us to consider you, but in fact, as we know, you're part of this other that's problematic for Christians. So I wonder, what do you do in a world like this, where even to us, we say, imagine, me in the back or my son in the front, think of us. They'd say, no, we mustn't think of them, because they're the ones who killed our Savior, so we can't think of them. We must just charge ahead. How do we function in a culture like that?
Yes, well, that sounds like some of the emails that I get fairly frequently. I now can cut and paste, so it doesn't take me that long to respond. If I get that in personal conversation, and even if I'm on email, it's a personal conversation. If you were to say something, first of all, I would come over and smile at you, because it's very difficult to be angry with somebody if they're smiling at you, right? Thank God for orthodontia. And I say, you know what? We're both in the image and likeness of God. And if you can't see that in me, you've lost some of that divinity that's already somehow part of you, and you've denied God's good creation, and you've denied what your Lord and Savior has told you, which is to pay attention to the people on the outside. And even if you want to consider me your enemy, you still have to love me. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of that love there. Are you really not taking Jesus seriously? And I do get a kind of, oh, because I'm not going to come back with violence. That doesn't help. It's kind of the turning the other cheek model. If you want to insult me, give me a really decent insult, and I'm going to absorb it because I'm not going to lower myself to the position of thinking that you're somehow demonic or that you're unhuman or non-human. So how do you temper justice with mercy? That's really hard. But I think a call for mercy is not a bad thing, nor is a call for justice. Because if we have one without the other, they're both intolerable.
Dean and AJ, if it's okay, we're going to get to some of the questions from the guests in attendance. The question here reads, can you talk a bit about changes in anti-Semitism post-October 7th?
Yeah, besides the fact that it's really worse now.
So, and then the question continues to say, settler colonialism in the book of Joshua versus in Israel-Palestine today.
Yep. History. As far as we know, historically speaking, there was no conquest. And the Bible itself tells us there was not. So Joshua looks kind of, to use the German term, a blitzkrieg. But if you go to the book of Judges, which comes next in the canon, it's clear that they didn't conquer very much of anything, because the Canaanite city-states are still in place, the Canaanite kings are still in place. They're living in the highlands for the most part, rather than on the fertile plains. So there is no conquest anyway, and the whole conquest narrative was probably written well after the fact for people taken into exile, speaking of settler colonialism, taken into exile by Babylon and trying to reclaim some sort of history on their own where they were not the losers. That makes sense to me. Somehow I don't see people, by the way, moving from ancient Babylon, that would be Iraq, to contemporary circumstances, or ancient Persia, which conquered Babylon and then engaged in, settler colonialism, to talk about Iran. Somehow it's only the Jews who get tagged on this. Are Jews settler colonialists? No, because they don't represent some foreign empire that's siphoning off resources locally and shipping them somewhere else. It's not as if the Jews who are in the land of Israel were there because they're the front runners of a colonization system. They're there because they're refugees or because they were thrown out of other countries. The majority Israeli population today doesn't code white. They're from places like North Africa, Argentina, and all of those Muslim countries that booted them in 1948. So let us not dismiss the Nakba, the catastrophe for the Palestinians, but think about the catastrophe that affected, I think the last number that I heard was 800,000 Jews. So if we look at places where there are no Jews, like, Libya. You know Libya because you know Simon of Cyrene. He's the one who carries Jesus' cross. Huge Jewish community in Libya in the first century, not a single Jew in Libya today. So Israel is not a settler colonial state. I don't think using the term apartheid is helpful either, because it's not the same thing as South Africa. I think social sins, I think that's the right word, they each take their own form, and I don't like merging one onto the other. So condemn settler expansion today, for example, some Jewish settlers who were burning down olive groves and torching Palestinian homes and cars. That's horrible. And what Hamas did was horrible. And when people ask me about proportionality, which is really hard, I don't know how to determine proportionality. And I really don't know how to determine it if the people you're trying to combat are set up in schools and hospitals and mosques. Could this have been stopped? Sure. Send back the hostages the day later, and this would not have happened. What do we do now? God, I don't know. That's so far above my pay grade. And I would like to see, if I had my wish, I would like to see people who are more interested in peace being in charge of governments in Gaza and in Israel than people whose concern for peace strikes me as not top of the line.
Hi, I have a question. What do you think of the parting of ways model, i.e., separation of Judaism and Christianity at a specific point in time? Mm-hmm. How does anti-Semitism fit into this model? And what about scholars who view Jewish Christianity as a helpful analytic category?
Well, that's a great question. Wow. So the parting of the ways is, when did Judaism and Christianity separate? And for a number of generations, scholars were saying, oh, it happened after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, or it happened after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the second revolt against Rome, in 132 to 135. The best explanation I heard on this comes from my friend Daniel Boyarin, who taught Talmud at UC Berkeley. And what Danny does is he uses the image of like a color wheel. Like you want to paint your house, so you go to the paint store and they give you a color wheel. And on this color wheel, you can see where orange is and you can see where red is, but you can't quite spot the place where it changes. And I think that's the most helpful way of looking at this parting of the ways model, or as some people have put it, the ways that never parted. So even after we think we've got a split, you've got people like St. Jerome, the one responsible for the Latin translation of the text, right, who talks about this group called the Nazareans. And he says, well, they worship Jesus, so the Jews don't want them, but they're following Jewish law, so the church doesn't want them. So let's, using an image from the book of Revelation, they're lukewarm, so let's spit them out. They don't think they've separated, right? The Ebionites didn't think they've separated. So it's really hard to figure out where this comes until we get to the 5th century, where by Roman law there's a separation. We also have the problem of officials saying you're separated when the laity don't think so. So it's like the bishop says do this, and the people do what they want, which is even more the case when the rabbis say this, and we Jews, fine, who elected you? We're going to do what we want. So even when you have somebody like Ignatius of Antioch in the beginning of the 2nd century saying it's separate, 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 the reason he keeps saying that is because they're not. Or John Chrysostom, a couple of generations later in Antioch, inveighing against his Christians who were going to the local synagogue and celebrating with Jews. What a fabulous idea. So the laity don't think they're separated. Chrysostom does. I'm not sure the term Jewish Christianity is very helpful. You can talk about Jews who follow Christian views or Messianic Jews. But once we start talking about Jewish Christianity versus Gentile Christianity, all sorts of stereotypes come in that are wrong. Like Gentile Christians don't follow the law. Well, that's Paul. And Paul's about as Jewish as you can get. A Pharisee, child of Pharisees, circumcised on the 8th day of the tribe of Benjamin. He's got more Jewish credentials than I do. But he's still saying law of free mission to the Gentiles. So the categories Jewish Christian and Gentile Christian, not very helpful.
Thank you, AJ. The next question. What do we do about the lack of education about religions? For example, this writer has a friend who thinks Christianity is the only religion that teaches love thy neighbor as thyself, which, yes, Jesus said, but was first in Leviticus.
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure that putting religion back into the public school system is the best answer for this. I live in Tennessee. But I do wish we just had better moral training, and that would be part of moral training, so we know where stuff comes from. It would be great if when Mark 12 was up on the lectionary and Jesus gets asked, what's the greatest commandment? He never directly answers the question, by the way. He always, like, I'll give you 2. Okay. Love of God and love of neighbor. And here's another place where this anti-Semitism comes in. So Leviticus 19:18, which is a love your neighbor as yourself, really means fellow Jew. It means fellow Israelite. Why? Because he is like you, or she is like you, they are like you are the same group. But Leviticus 19 goes on to say in verse 34, you have to love the stranger. The Hebrew term is ger, and it really means not native born. So migrant, immigrant, sojourner, you have to love the ger because you were gerim in the land of Egypt. So you love the fellow Jew because he or she is one of you, and you love the not native born because you knew what it was like. So one's based on identity, the other's based on experience. And what happened in Christianity is that the category of not native born dropped out. Because, again, Jews are an ethnic group, which is something else this whole settler colonialism model doesn't quite get. How can you be a settler in your own country? That's just weird. It's also the homeland of the Palestinians, grant that too. For Jews, you had Jews, and then you had other people. Right? For the church, you were either a neighbor, which meant fellow Christian, a potential convert, or an apostate. So there wasn't room for the other to be other. The other had to become part of same. The category of stranger drops out. This is where Jesus comes in handy, because in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was a not native born. I was a migrant. I was an immigrant, and you welcomed me. You didn't force me to be you, but you gave me food to eat and a place to stay and some company. That's where that stranger needs to come back in.
In her sermon, incidentally, Bishop Buddy, you've probably heard it, specifically quotes the passage about the stranger, and that we were all strangers. Interestingly enough, she speaks of it in terms of this country, but it was an interesting use of the text.
This question asks, how do you explain the death of Jesus without putting a negative emphasis on the Jewish religious leaders?
Oh, that one I can do. This is Paul. Paul talks about the night that Jesus was handed over. The word handed over in Greek is paradidomi. Para, you know, from like parable or parallel. Just put something side by side. And didomi means to give, so you hand over something. But the word paradidomi can also mean to betray. So when Paul talks about the night that he was handed over, he's handed over by God, and Paul makes that abundantly clear. It's God who consigns Jesus to the cross, and Jesus goes willingly. And when we start looking at all four Gospels in terms of Jesus' passion, moving from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, the Jews look worse and worse and worse as you get farther and farther along from Mark over to John. So we can see the antipathy toward Jews and Judaism coming in. So why is that there? And that was part of the other question as well. Because the early followers of Jesus, and remember, they're all, the whole first group are Jews. They can't figure out why their fellow Jews can't get with the program. Because they're convinced that Jesus is the incarnate God who rose from the dead, who paid the penalty for human sin. All that theological, they're convinced of it. And they can't figure out why their fellow Jews are not. Well, human beings are like this. So there are people who voted this way in the election and people who voted that way in the election. They can't figure out why their neighbors voted the way they did. Right, so we start making up all sorts of, they're silly, they're uninformed, whatever. No, they know what they're doing, for the most part. So the church had to figure out how come the Jews didn't get with the program. Paul says, I'm in the Epistle to the Romans here. Well, Israel has currently been bent from this branch, this olive tree, so that the Gentiles can be grafted on. The expression is contrary to nature, which is an interesting expression. But Paul says at the end of Romans 11, all Israel will be saved. And by Israel, Paul means Jews. The Greek is katasarka, according to the flesh, like ethnic Jews will get saved. So they don't have to worry about Jews now, because at the end of time, we'll all get with the program. That's fine, I can wait. Matthew says they were misled by their leaders. Well, that only works for a generation or two. After 3 or 4 generations, they've made their decision. John says they're children of the devil, and they were never expected to get it to begin with. So the New Testament, like the scriptures of Israel, has multiple voices speaking to different communities at different times. And the church can determine, I want to read this way rather than that way. The synagogue, I want to read with the book of Jonah, which is read on Yom Kippur, about the repentance and therefore the sparing of the city of Nineveh, that great and wicked city, as opposed to reading the prophet Nahum, which is, let's destroy Nineveh. You can choose which way to read. I think the church can choose better than sometimes it has chosen. But it's easier to have a scapegoat than it is to say, it's a mystery.
Thank you, AJ. I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Some modern evangelicals seem to fetishize Jews as a part of the end time prophecies. Is there something inherently anti-Semitic there?
It depends upon how it's getting deployed. Anytime one group uses another group to determine what its own history is always going to be a problem. And to set a group up on a pedestal can be just as dangerous as to marginalize that group and make it subhuman. Right? We saw this in histories of sexism, right? Well, I'm going to put women up on the pedestal, and they shouldn't be bothered with silly little things like equal pay for equal work, because they're up on a pedestal. I don't like being used as part of somebody else's end-time history, particularly if that particular view enters politics. But even when we talk about what's generally called Christian Zionism, not all Christian Zionists are interested in end-time politics. So there are some who are interested in getting all Jews in the world to emigrate to the land of Israel so that Jesus can come back, with the idea is that he's not going to come back unless we're there to welcome him. I personally am holding up the show. My husband is allergic to sesame products. With all the hummus and tahina that's in the, he's not moving. So he is, as he puts it, an anti-Semite. So I'm not moving, right? Some Christian Zionists are Christian Zionists because they think the world owes Jews something following World War II. Some are what might be called America Firsters, because God says to Abraham in Genesis 12, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So these Americans are thinking, well, if Abraham's the father of the Jews, then we need to be nice to the Jews and therefore support Israel, because that way God will bless us in America. This requires too many steps theologically for me, but that's their particular reading of Genesis. Some of them really don't care about Jews that much, but they really hate Muslims. So let's have a Jewish state as a buffer there, because we can't trust all these other countries in the area. So even when I talk to Christian Zionists, they have very, very different views of how they view the land of Israel in the end times. Christians pretty much have to deal with Jews because we show up in the Christian canon. You've got to figure out what to do with us. We're the chosen people, and somehow something happened, and we didn't get with the program. So as long as we show up in the gospel reading, or as long as we show up in Paul, then Christians have to deal with us. We Jews have to deal with Christians because you're kind of running the country in a variety of ways. You're the majority. We have to deal with you.
That's so interesting. I mean, that really was a very interesting sort of parsing of that whole thing, because I've never really even considered that there were so many layers. But that's very helpful.
So once you label somebody as a Christian Zionist or an Episcopalian or a Baptist or a Jew or whatever, the next question is, well, what kind of Episcopalian are you, or what kind of Jew are you? You know, what are your thoughts on whatever? Yankees, Red Sox, major tension in my relationship. Husband was born across the street from Yankee Stadium, imprinted like a duck. I'm from Massachusetts. How do you make peace? Well, it's possible. Yeah.
Don't go to bed angry.
Don't go to bed angry. Figure out where you are, and if there's a game on, go into the other room. So that we can't stereotype people by knowing where they go to church. That just tells me what you do on Sunday morning, but it doesn't tell me what you believe. I'm a member of an Orthodox synagogue. I don't keep any of the commandments. I mean, I keep the don't murder and don't commit adultery. But I'm very happy with a good lobster dinner.
I'm really glad you added that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so I don't keep the dietary regulations. I will drive in a car on the Sabbath. I will work on my computer on the Sabbath. But I'm a member of an Orthodox synagogue.
Could you speak more to the Peter and James passages in the book of Acts, Luke Acts, regarding Jewish-Gentile continuity in the church, and how that speaks to formation of the church and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, thanks. So in Acts chapter 10, which is where we can start this, Peter, he's staying at the home of a fellow called Simon the Tanner. Tanner are people who process hides to make leather. You process hides, by the way, by boiling them in urine, which helps. So he goes up on the roof, probably to get away from the stench, and he has this dream where all these animals come down on a sheet, like, snakes and icky things, creepy crawly things, and God says, the voice from heaven says, rise, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter says, I've never eaten anything unkosher before. I think he's having a nightmare from the smell. So this happens 3 times. The sheet goes back up into heaven, knocking on the door. These people from a fellow named Cornelius, he's a Roman army officer, lives in Caesarea. Cornelius had also had a divine revelation, sends for Peter, right? So Peter determines, this has nothing to do with diet. It has to do with not calling anybody unclean, right? So he goes to Cornelius' house, and Cornelius is not circumcised. He's not Jew. He's clearly not Jewish, but he's got grace, right? So he's got this divine revelation about the Christ, and Peter converts him. So that when we get to chapter 15, I'm 5 chapters on, there's something called the Jerusalem Council, or the Apostolic Council. Because a group of Pharisees who are members of the church, that shouldn't sound weird, Paul's a Pharisee who's a member of the church, says, what do we do with all these Gentiles? Well, we ought to circumcise them, because, I'm extrapolating here, the book of Genesis, God says to Abraham, unless you are circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, you are cut off from the covenant. I think that's a pun, by the way, but I can't prove it. Just think about it. So that, let's circumcise them. And then Peter has to get up and say, no. It worked with Cornelius. The Holy Spirit came on him and his family. It's all good. So they decide, and the show is now being run by James, who's either Jesus' cousin or Jesus' brother or Jesus' half-brother, depending upon the church you go to. I'm a Jew. I don't have a horse in that race. And James says, oh, no, we don't have to circumcise them. We'll just send out a letter to all of the churches in which we will say you can't eat anything with blood in it, because that goes back to Noah, right? Getting off the ark, you can now eat meat, but you can't consume blood. You can't eat an animal that's been strangled. You can't eat an animal that's been offered to an idol, because that's where you would normally get your food in the cities, is you would have animal sacrifices in the temples, and then you would put the leftover meat on the market. And you can't engage in porneia, which is some sort of untoward sexual behavior. And that's how they resolved it. Did this ever happen? Well, Paul never tells us this happened, and that would have been a good thing for Paul to have told us. Absence of evidence, however, is not evidence of absence. We still have some Christian groups like Jehovah's Witnesses who won't consume blood, including blood transfusion, and some conservative Protestants who still follow these commandments. Not eating meat offered to idols is pretty much, that's easy today. Meat that's been strangled, what do you do with a chicken? Yeah. Is this gradual separation? Maybe. But I think what's going on with Luke, who also wrote Luke and Acts, is I think Acts is early spin control, trying to show that Peter and Paul got along really, really well. Because if you just read Paul's letters, they don't get along so well. So I think this is Luke retelling the history of the church to show how, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, everything worked perfectly. Why do I doubt this? Because I've never been to a committee meeting where everybody agreed on everything. It's just weird.
AJ, if you could recommend a book or a podcast or other resource that deals with the violence and the often vengeful God of the Old Testament.
Well, I would stop using that term. In the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which I co-edited with Mark Brettler, Mark and I finished this past Sunday, a week ago today, the 3rd edition, which will be out in 2026. We added several new essays at the end, one of which is the stereotype of the Old Testament God of wrath versus the New Testament God of love. When I get that sort of nonsense from my students, because it's an unfortunate and uninformed stereotype, I just look at them and I engage in what's called proof texting. Proof texting is just dragging out a verse to make it do what you want it to do. So I say, fine. The Lord is my shepherd who leads me beside still waters and restores my soul. That's Psalm 23. But you, looking at the clergy, you are condemned to the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, which means I have a good shepherd and you have a sadistic dentist. You see violence, have a look at the book of Revelation. Violence, Jesus condemning entire cities like Capernaum and Chorazin and Bethsaida. It will be worse for you on the day of judgment than it would be for the people of Sodom. Or the book of Revelation condemning the world 1/3 times if you can't count it all up. God doesn't get a personality transplant sometime around the book of 1 Maccabees. It's all the same God who is unpredictable and sometimes very, very violent and sometimes showing extraordinary mercy. So I would have to rephrase the question. Jews don't worship a God of wrath and violence. Or we don't worship a God of wrath and violence any more than Christians do. It might be a better way of phrasing it. I think the God you worship is the God you want.
Thank you, AJ. As far as Paul's writings are concerned, do you think any of the differences in his approach to faith, textual interpretations, ritual, etc., has to do with the differences that existed between Hellenized Jewish circles and those living in Judea?
It's also a very good question. It's highly likely. So it could have been the case that in the diaspora outside the land of Israel, so that would be Galilee and Judea, Jews would have very little problem sharing table fellowship with Gentiles, whereas in Judea, where there are fewer Gentiles, that might have been an issue. And that conceivably could have explained the problem where Paul and Peter have a food fight in Antioch. This is Galatians chapter 2. Paul's writing in Greek. The people in Judea and Galilee speak Aramaic. They probably spoke a little bit of Hebrew, and only the very, very well-educated would have been competent in Greek. And whenever you move languages, stuff changes, just because of the way linguistics works. Paul also has to introduce himself to his Gentile congregation. So remember, Paul's not writing to Jews. He's writing to Gentiles who were new at this whole thing. So whereas the Jews might have been from generations familiar with the various laws, the various stories, this is new stuff for a bunch of Gentiles. So he's got to go more slowly and in some cases in more detail. So the pedagogical approach would be different. If I'm talking to an intro class, I will use a different pedagogical approach than if I'm talking to a PhD seminar, because I can presuppose different levels of knowledge.
I think we're almost to 2 o'clock, so I think this is going to have to be our last question. And for those of you who submitted questions and didn't have them answered, we apologize, but AJ, will you be, Dr. Levine, will you be around afterwards a bit for people to talk? Great.
This last question is asking, what can progressive seminaries do for real against anti-Semitism? And maybe if we expanded it a little bit, could you just offer, I know you've mentioned a lot of different things for us to be considering and thinking about, maybe a toolkit of sorts that we could kind of think through as we continue to engage in this this work.
And there, in fact, if you go online, there are a number of toolkits that are actually called anti-Semitism toolkits. Some of which are more helpful than others, but it also depends upon what would be helpful for one class might not be helpful for another, because not all seminaries and divinity schools are alike either. Using helpful resources like the Jewish Annotated New Testament would be good. What we do in these volumes is where we know that sermons have gone a little sideways, we pull out little gray boxes saying, don't go here, go there. Or if you want to know who the Pharisees are, we give you an essay. If you want to know how the temple system functioned, we give you an essay, and so on. I have volunteered at pretty much every conference I've been to do Zoom programs or on-site programs just for expenses, and if it's Zoom, it's nothing, for seminarians. Catholic seminaries have picked this up more frequently than Protestant seminaries will. Black seminaries have picked this up more frequently than white seminaries have, and I don't know what drives this. But if you give me 2 hours with a seminary class, I can beat out most of their anti-Semitism. Because I can find where it's located, you can surface it, you can do it in a way that's not designed to induce guilt. I'm a Jewish mother, I know how to make people feel guilty. That's not my agenda. But to say basically, here's why these bad things happen. If you can diagnose the problem, you're more likely to get rid of some of the symptoms. And then here are some of the symptoms. And invariably they say, oh, I always thought that. I didn't realize that that's how that sounded, and so on. So you can call me, right? I've clearly failed at retirement, so just keep trying on that. There are resources on how better to preach this material. The dean already mentioned some work that's been done by the Anglican Church on this. So there's plenty of stuff that's available. What needs to be done is people in the classroom doing it. And the problem is that the people in the classroom don't know who's supposed to do it. So the people who teach homiletics, that's sermon writing, think it's going to be done in the Bible classes. The people in the Bible classes think it's going to be done in the polity classes, which is what the denomination teaches. The people in the polity classes think, oh, that's going to be done in church history, or we get to like Luther or something like that. And the church historians think the theologians are supposed to. So nobody gets assigned. And until deans of seminaries and divinity schools say we need to do something on this, it's not going to happen. And it has to happen. At the same time, by the way, I wish that all rabbinical seminaries train their students in Christianity, because that's majority culture, train students in Islam, and train students how to deal with people of other religious traditions. Because until we learn how to speak the language of our neighbors, we're not going to be able to be in communication with them more fully. And I think that's part of respect. For me as a Jew, I want Christians to know more about Jews than a production of Fiddler on the Roof, something about the Shoah, the Holocaust, and something about Mr. Netanyahu. I want more than that. In the same way, I think Jews need to know more about Christianity than what happens in the Macy's window at Christmas time and SantaCon. I got caught in that 2 years ago. God, that was scary. So we need to know more about each other's traditions, and that may be the job, not of the public school system, but it may be the job of different churches and synagogues and mosques to open up and say, come visit us, come get a taste of Islam, come get a taste of Judaism, come get a taste of Christianity, ask the questions you want to ask. That might be a nice thing to do.
Well, you may be a Jewish mother who knows how to make people feel guilty, but I don't feel guilty. I just feel grateful, and I feel just as grateful as I did last year when you were here. And I'm so grateful that I can have this conversation with you and can welcome all of you into the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And I want to assure you, whoever you are, whatever your religious tradition or lack of religious tradition, you are welcome here. You are welcome here for occasions like this and for everything else that happens at this cathedral. So first of all, thanks to Dr. Levine, AJ. I don't want these flowers thrown at me, AJ. And congratulations to all of you, and thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you very much.